Talking Points with Keith Vaz, celebrating diversity. Lyca, London.
Welcome back. This is Keith Vaz on Talking Points on Lyca Radio. From the UK, let's fly to Colombo in Sri Lanka and talk to my next guest. South Asia is home to nearly 2 billion people and includes behemoths like India, Pakistan, Bangladesh and Sri Lanka. It's one of the world's most strategically significant regions because it connects the Indian Ocean with the Middle East and East Asia. My second guest on the program is Nilanthan, the Executive Director of the Centre for Law and Security Studies, CLASS, and one of South Asia's respected voices on geopolitics and strategic affairs. His research and analysis have been published by world-renowned institutions like Yale, Johns Hopkins, and Columbia University. He's a regular commentator on television, radio, and digital platforms, including Strat News Global, where he provides expert insights into global and regional security. Alongside his research, he teaches at Sri Lanka's National Defence College, educating senior military and police leaders on strategy, security, and international affairs. So let's go over to Colombo in Sri Lanka and talk to Niruthan. Good morning, Nilanthan.
Good morning, Keith. Thank you for having me on.
Well, it's a pleasure to talk to you because it's one of the regions we don't really cover. We always seem to talk about India, but not the strategic area that India surrounds. It is one of the most important regions in the world. What do you think the biggest security challenges are facing the region as a whole?
To be brief, I'd flag two basic concerns at the moment. The first is obviously the nuclear aspect. So South Asia has two nuclear powers, as you know, India and Pakistan, both of whom don't really get along, for me to put it mildly. Not to mention China, which also borders South Asia as a nuclear giant. So that's one major red flag. The second is that South Asia is currently in a period of political transition. So new regimes in Nepal and Bangladesh, relatively new regimes in Sri Lanka and the Maldives, India aspiring to be a global power, Pakistan aspiring to be a global mediator, the Afghan Taliban still recalibrating their worldview and so on. So the political identity of South Asia is itself in a state of flux. So the nuclear and the political identity issues are two macro challenges we can immediately flag.
Now, you mentioned Sri Lanka, which is where you're talking to me from today. Sri Lanka sits at the heart of the Indian Ocean, and it's just recently got a new government. It's off our radar in terms of international activity at the moment, after, of course, the conflict that was in there, which has been going on for years, the election of a new government. To the left of centre, how is the new government doing and how is that sitting with these strategic powers that thought they really ran Sri Lanka?
Well, to be honest, the relationship between Sri Lanka and India, I would say, is at arguably an all-time high at the moment, where there seems to be a certain understanding between the strategic communities of both sides that they sort of need each other. I mean, look, in general, almost all of the shipping traffic that flows into Southeast and East Asia from the Western Hemisphere passes by Sri Lanka. It might not be a choke point in the sense of a Hormuz or a Malacca Strait, since it's the open sea, but whoever exerts influence over Sri Lanka is certainly well positioned to influence global shipping as well. And we see this in their strategies, whether this is India's Sagar Doctrine or China's Belt and Road Initiative or America's Indo-Pacific strategy. We see all of them acknowledging this island as a vital piece in that larger puzzle. And the fact that Britain no longer has interest in Sri Lanka could also, in some cases, be a commentary on Britain's role in global geopolitics at the moment.
Now, looking at the big powers and their relationship with a country like Sri Lanka or Nepal, you mentioned the fact that there's a new government in there. How important is that relationship? Obviously, Russia is having its own war with Ukraine, so maybe not the big player it was in the past. I'll come on to China in part two. But do you have to now, if you're a Sri Lankan or a Nepalese leader, bend the knee to the United States if you want to get anything done, or can you go it alone?
Well, to be honest, you have a choice between India and the United States and China. But the problem is that many of these nations often flip-flop on those policies. So, for instance, during the recent West Asian crisis, the Indian Oil Corporation still fulfilled its contractual obligations to Bangladesh and ensured that barrels of oil were given. Sri Lanka was given many barrels of oil. So India can be a first responder when there's a currency crisis, when there's an environmental crisis, when there's an energy crisis. But many of these countries often flip-flop. I mean, over the last 15 years, the Maldives, for instance, has changed from a US stance to a pro-China stance multiple times. Sri Lanka has oscillated between India and China multiple times, and South Asia in general can be quite unstable when it comes to whom their friends are and whom their rivals are. So it's this instability in terms of their alliances that make them so vulnerable rather than having to bend the knee to any particular nation.
This is Keith Vaz on Talking Points on Lyca Radio. I'm talking to Nilanthan Niruthan, who is the Executive Director of the Centre for Law and Security Studies, big think tank in South Asia, and he's known, of course, also as a respected geopolitical analyst. In part 2, we're going to be talking a little bit about China, which has been the dominant force over there, and also how are these countries going to work together, knowing how different they all are. Join us after the break.
Keith Vaz on Talking Points, Lyca.
Welcome back. This is Keith Vaz on Talking Points on Lyca Radio. I am having a very interesting conversation with Nilanthan Niruthan, the Executive Director of the Centre for Law and Security Studies and a geopolitical analyst. His organisation, CLASS, is based in Colombo, Sri Lanka, but it covers the whole of the South Asian region. Niruthan, China used to be, did it not, the dominant force in the area? Obviously, India is there. You cannot ignore India if you are Nepal or you are Sri Lanka. But China made some really big headway. But we don't hear very much about that these days. Is it still a force to be reckoned with?
I think you flagged a very important issue there. A decade ago, the Chinese were full of optimism for these mega infrastructure projects all over South Asia, right? Roads, ports, bridges, and so on, as you rightly mentioned. But we rarely hear about any progress made by these projects since then. And from what we hear, the Chinese have expressed a certain level of frustration to all of their South Asian partners. But ultimately, what the pace that the Chinese expect, I don't think will ever be viable in a region where the regimes have been changing with the frequency that we've seen in South Asia. So with some of the policy flip-flops that we just discussed in the previous segment, I don't see infrastructure projects rolling forward at the pace that the Chinese want them rolled out. And this has been a huge sticking point for them.
And do people have to go and visit President in China? Does he make visits to the region? Is there that kind of relevance to what they're doing now as it was 10 years ago, or is that fading?
To be honest, in terms of high-level visits and all that, we've not seen it with the same level, with the same frequency as we did a decade ago. So it's quite clear that the Chinese have other priorities as well. And to a certain extent, I think there's also a recognition that ultimately many of these nations, when push comes to shove, will turn to India as the first responder. And no matter how much you dangle in front of them, when emergency strikes, many of these countries instinctively turn to India for help. And that's an advantage that the Chinese simply cannot surpass because of the geographic disadvantage.
Now, amongst your multitasking that you do, not just in terms of your think tank, but the other events and other activities you're involved in, one of them, which interests me a lot, is that you teach senior officers at Sri Lanka's National Defence College about the current security threats. I'll come on to AI in a minute, but first of all, on cybersecurity, we used to, again, hear a lot about this in the past. Have we conquered cybersecurity now? Do you think that everyone understands how serious a threat it is? And have nations been able to deal with this threat on their own, or do they have to have collaboration?
To be honest, I wouldn't say we've even scratched the surface in terms of identifying cybersecurity threats as a metric. And you're absolutely right. Many of these are non-traditional threats where even gauging how much progress we've made in terms of countering them can be extremely hard, because there's a sensitive issue involved here as well, right? With many of these new technologies, not just in South Asia, but often around the world, the policymakers themselves are not necessarily as well versed in these technologies compared to a younger demographic. So in that sense, it makes it very, very difficult to come up with practical legislative solutions to deal with these problems. And cybersecurity is just one of them. There's a whole host of new techs for which we face the same problem.
Now, this is very much the age of the drone, isn't it? The work that you do in many ways interfaces with organizations that are involved in military expenditure. You can conduct a war now between Russia and Ukraine without human beings, can't you? You can just buy a whole lot of drones and use the drones to get rid of your enemies. This wasn't the case in South Asia until now, because we've not really had a war in your region, if I can call it your region, for some time. But if you do, will it be the age of the drones? Will it be drones fighting drones?
I don't think we have a choice but to bend to technology's whims, and that's the current meta, so to speak, of warfare. I mean, look at modern conflicts, not just the Russia-Ukraine war, but even the Iranian war, where drone warfare has become a key component of all military operations in these theaters. So whether it's surveillance or targeting or rescue, or even just an outright explosion, example of a modern security threat that a small country like Sri Lanka with a limited budget would be most vulnerable to, and therefore pay the closest attention to.
Final question, and it's a difficult one, but you're asked this question all the time. You're asked to look into the future. Looking ahead over the next 5 to 10 years, what opportunities and risks do you believe will define the future of South Asia and the wider Indo-Pacific region? It sounds like an essay-type question, but what should we be looking out for?
If I could condense the problem into one word, it's connectivity. That's the fundamental element here for both opportunities and risks in South Asia. South Asian nations have very, very little connectivity with each other, especially economically. So the USA, for example, is Bangladesh's and Sri Lanka's biggest export market, even though logically their biggest export market should be India, which is right next door. And this lack of integration ends up making the entire region unstable, because they go through all kinds of ups and downs, like we've discussed here. Even the Taliban and the Pakistani government, who were friends until recently, are now at war with each other. So the basic issue here is connectivity, which leads to lack of integration, and this leads to these countries hating and loving each other in cycles. And the defining feature of South Asia moving forward, unfortunately, will be this until something is done about it.
Niruthan, it has been an absolute pleasure talking to you today. Thank you for joining us from a region that we don't really talk enough about, and I'm sure this is the first of many appearances that you're going to make on Talking Points. We always ask our special guests to choose a song that means something special to them and to dedicate it to someone special. Which song would you like to choose, and to whom would you like to dedicate it to?
I would like to dedicate a Tamil song called Enjoy Enjami to my mother, Kohala Niruthan, and my father, Niruthan Rajasundaram.
I have to tell you, you obviously can look into the future and read people's minds, because Dee's Enjoy Enjami is one of my top 10 favourites ever.
Wow, that's analytical power for you. Yes,
it is. I'm sure it's not on the internet. Thank you for joining us, and have a wonderful Sri Lankan Sunday.
Thank you very much, Keith, for having me on the program today, and best wishes to all the listeners of Lyca Radio from Sri Lanka and worldwide. So thank you.
Let's hear the song chosen by Niruthan, and it happens to be one of our top 10. Enjoy Enjami.
எங்கூரு குத்தாளமே சுருக்க பைய மொட்டையம்மா வெத்தல மட்டையம்மா சுமந்த கையம்மா மத்தல மொட்டையம்மா தாயம்மா தாயம்மா என்ன பண்ண மாயம்மா பள்ளியம்மா வேறாண்டி சங்கதிய கூறாண்டி கண்ணடிய காணாண்டி இந்த
அண்ண கிளி அடியால மரக்கிழவண்ண கிளி நல்லபடி வாழ சொல்லி இந்த மண்ணை கொடுத்தானே பூர்வ குடி கம்மங்கர காணி எல்லாம் பாடி திரிஞ்சானே ஆதிக்குடி நாய் நரி பூனைக்கும் தான் இந்த ஏரி குளம் கூட சொந்தமடி என்ஜாமி வாங்கோ வாங்கோ ஒன்னாரி அம்மா ஏ அம்பாரி இந்தா இந்தா மும்மாரி என்ஜாமி வாங்கோ வாங்கோ ஒன்னாரி அம்மா ஏ அம்பாரி இந்தா இந்தா மும்மாரி குக்கு முட்டைய போடும் கோழிக்கு குக்கு ஒப்பனை யாரு மயிலுக்கு குக்கு பச்சைய பூசும் பாசிக்கு குச்சிய அடுக்கின கூட்டுக்கு
பாடுபட்ட மக்கா மரப்பு மேட்டுக்கார வேர்வ தண்ணி சொக்கா மினுக்கு நாட்டுக்கார அகட்டி கருப்பட்டி பூதாங்கோடு மண்ணு சட்டி அதோட கூடு கட்டி ஆரம்பிச்ச நாகரிகம் செஞ்சன ஜனக்கு ஜன மக்களே உப்புக்கு சப்பு கொட்டு முட்டைக்குள்ள சட்டு கொட்டு அட்டைக்கு ரத்தம் கொட்டு கிட்டி புல்லு மெட்டு மெட்டு
அஞ்சு மரம் வளர்த்து அழகான தோட்டம் வச்சு தோட்டம் செழிச்சாலும் கடலே கரையே வனமே சனமே நிலமே கொலமே இடமே தடமே
என்ஜாமி வாங்கோ வாங்கோ ஒன்னாரி அம்பாரி அம்பாரி இந்தா இந்தா மும்மாரி